Are we finally seeing an end to inflation? Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. The global economy's largest challenge over the past year has likely been inflation, which has proven to be far more enduring than most people initially thought. But will inflation eventually return to more normal levels now that central banks all around the world are rising interest rates? So before we start the video, if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please subscribe it and press the bell icon. Since it has a real physical impact on how we live our lives, inflation is a crucial topic of interest for both economists and the general public. For the past 2 years, this has been the situation. Low borrowing rates and large amounts of government spending have combined to promote consumer demand, which has led to sustained inflation. Companies who have been able to raise their prices under the pretense of keeping up with inflation, which they are actively contributing to by raising their prices, are experiencing supply chain issues and engaging in good old profit maximization. In contrast to other economic issues, you will generally be fine if you are able to keep your employment. Because it is so difficult to avoid, inflation disproportionately hurts those with the lowest incomes. As terrifying as it is to think about, we have been addressing the topic of inflation on this channel ever since the first plant started closing down and stimulus payments started being distributed. Since then, there have been countless contrasting reports about inflation from news organizations, governments, and central banks all over the world. These reports have ranged over time from claims that inflation is not a problem, to claims that it is only temporary, to claims that inflation is shifting these organizations' economic priorities. But with inflation, like everything else, what rises must fall. It should only be a matter of time before living expenditures for ordinary people stop skyrocketing now that reducing inflation has become the top objective of many governments throughout the world. It might not, however, be that simple. Additionally, there are exogenous forces that, despite drastic government involvement, can maintain prices stubbornly high. Learning how to manage an economy well and what may go wrong if we don't can help us understand how inflation can return to a healthy level. What economic factors should we be on the lookout for in order to help economies lower prices? What economic pressures will be difficult for governments and central banks to combat since they are driving up prices? And finally, can we anticipate a decrease in the cost of basic goods to bring them back to the levels we're experiencing prior to these economic disruptions? Or is this the current standard? And if prices don't go up any higher, should we be just content with them? Raising interest rates. The Reserve Bank governor in Australia, Philip Lowe, took an extraordinary action. He said sorry. He had to apologize because he had declared in early 2021 that he wouldn't raise historically low interest rates until at least 20 or 24, due to the fact that even very huge debt loads could be managed when they were spread out over 30 years with a very low interest rate payment linked to them. Many Australians felt confident taking out new mortgages or extending the ones they already had. The Australian Reserve Bank had raised the cash rate 8 times since the announcement, reaching a level that is nearly twice as high as it was prior to the lockdowns and trade issues of 2020. As a result, many Australians are currently feeling mortgage hardships because they are paying interest rates that are 3 times more than they were 2 years ago on mortgages that have grown to record-breaking levels due to the epidemic. In defense of the Australian Reserve Bank, that statement was made with the provision that rates wouldn't be raised unless inflation became a serious issue, something they truly weren't anticipating at the time. In fact, no one ever listens to dull circumstances. They simply heard about cheap money, which led them to believe that they would become real estate billionaires. Additionally, we now understand that inflation did emerge as a significant problem. Today, central banks are intelligent. They were aware that their low interest rates could lead to inflation, especially when accompanied with record-high government stimulus. However, they believe that if it was handled appropriately, this might even be a beneficial thing. Stimulative effect of inflation. The economy is stimulated by inflation itself. People will be more likely to invest their money to generate returns that can outpace inflation, or to make consumer purchases now rather than delaying them until inflation has had a chance to drive up prices if they notice that their money is buying less and less each year. On a personal level, you probably already see this process in action. I'm prepared to acknowledge that I probably justified making some foolish purchases to myself between now and 2020, since it makes no sense to have too much cash now when inflation is so high and interest rates are so low. I made a few significant purchases in 2020 because I could see inflation coming. You're a lot more disciplined than I am if you didn't fall into this line of reasoning. Most people did though. Additionally, this raises investor and consumer expenditure overall in an economy. After an initial fall brought on by fear and uncertainty early in the pandemic, inflation was notably concentrated at asset markets and markets that people had convinced themselves were assets. Low borrowing cost and the first ever dumping of stimulus checks into the market propelled stocks to record highs. Alternative markets, such as those for cryptocurrencies, Pokemon cards, and high-end products also boomed as consumers sought ways to show off or gamble with their newly acquired cash. This inflation persists. Simply put, inflation is an increase in the cost of goods and services throughout the economy. However, since stocks, cryptocurrencies, collectibles, and even real estate are not directly included in the Consumer Price Index, which is normally how headline inflation is measured, it is not the type of inflation we typically pay attention to. Price inflation probably wouldn't have been a major issue for the overall economy if it had been restricted to these markets. Because they own the most investments, wealthy people stand to gain the most from the rising value of investments. Hence, it would have worsened inequality. Even though this would make the Gini coefficient look awful, it wouldn't have had a negative impact on the standard of living for average economic participants, because just because someone else is growing richer doesn't indicate that you are getting poorer. The actual issue began when cost for non-speculative necessities like food, energy, and rent began to rise quickly. There were other factors at play in this. Cost of inflation. The difficulties in the supply chain brought on by lockdowns, shipping, a lack of containers, and changes in the global merchant marine fleet served as the catalyst for products like food and general consumer goods. The invasion of Ukraine and the resulting shipping problems served as the ignition for items like energy, while the increase in the value of real estate assets served as the ignition for rents. In the majority of nations, this was transferred from landlords to tenants. A spark, however, is useless without fuel, and since there were trillions of additional dollars in everyone's pockets, they could afford to pay slightly more for a meal out, or to get a fancy car with a discount, a mock-up that would guzzle very expensive fuel. Prices would continue to grow if consumers were able to pay and remain willing to do so. Furthermore, many of the early economic factors that drove price increases are no longer in play, because as long as the status quo persisted, there is no market mechanism for prices to decline. The price of international shipping did reach a peak, but it has since returned to affordable levels. Additionally, because retailers over-ordered goods earlier in the year in an effort to keep their shelves stocked, they are currently hanging on to an excess of inventory because they are currently getting goods more quickly than they can move them. This situation, known as an inventory bullwhip, is detrimental to firms because it sometimes necessitates renting out more warehouse space merely for inventory storage. In most major real estate markets, the rising home values that initially drive up rental prices are simultaneously on the decline, all over the place. The reason why consumer prices and rents haven't decreased despite cheaper shipping costs, an abundance of supply, and corresponding housing markets is that businesses and landlords can still charge these rates and customers are still ready to pay them. Price stickiness. In this process, sticky pricing plays a role. Sticky pricing is the delay in altering a product's price to account for market conditions. Some pricing can be exceedingly unmovable. Share prices on a securities market, for example, fluctuate every single second as a result of shifting levels of supply and demand. However, as agreements for services like rent are typically made for periods of 6 months or a year, it naturally takes some time to respond to changes in the external markets. Groceries, subscriptions, and everything else you purchase in a given month falls somewhere in the middle of this range of price stickiness. As a result, businesses have chosen to maintain high pricing in order to achieve record profits, and rent continues to be a problem for individuals who are not lucky enough to own their own house. This is what prompted 4 central banks to begin raising interest rates earlier this year. Raising interest rates will cause families and businesses to spend a bigger portion of their income on interest payments, leaving less available for other uses. Given that many of the supply-side problems we were facing at the beginning of the year, such as shipping costs and stock levels, are starting to resolve themselves, this, along with the government support programs being reduced, means that there is less money flowing around the economy to sustain higher prices. Therefore, a decrease in demand and an increase in supply of products and services should result in falling pricing. The only issue is that prices have not yet decreased. The rate at which prices return to normal will be slowed down by the same kind of sticky pricing that delayed the start of inflation. Additionally, it usually takes longer for businesses and landlords to change prices downward than upward, unless there is fierce rivalry in their marketplaces, which there isn't at the time. Furthermore, employment has reached relatively solid despite high borrowing rates and significantly less generous government assistance programs than they were during the first 2 years of the pandemic. Therefore, people are still able to afford expensive items and services with their earnings. But perhaps things are beginning to shift. Slow reduction of inflation. Everything we've looked at so far has had some latency between when changes occur and when those changes become apparent. It took some time for markets to fall and unemployment to rise when the world first went into lockdown. Despite the extraordinary disruption to our contemporary global economy, things took some time to recover when interest rates were lowered and government stimulus programs were implemented, and inflation took even longer to establish itself in highly liquid markets for speculative assets like equities. Finally, markets that catch our attention, like those whose prices are monitored by the Consumer Price Index, will take far longer for inflation to become apparent. As a result of rising interest rates, we are currently observing a very identical pattern moving in the opposite direction. Liquid assets, such as highly active markets, have fallen sharply this year, especially those that represent companies that heavily relied on low-cost borrowing. The same has happened in other speculative sectors, such as cryptocurrencies, and even products that people bought to flaunt their wealth have witnessed steep price drops in recent months. Although no one, least of all economists, can foretell the future, this pattern would imply that the next 2 goods to see their prices drop are common consumer goods. They might be oddities like energy, depending on how the situation in Ukraine plays out. The forces bringing price down, however, now exceeds the forces raising prices generally. During the holiday season, when people often spend the most money on gifts, parties, vacations, and other pleasures, it will be vital to keep a watch on household discretionary spending. We have a good cause to be positive if economies can get through the season and retain a high level of employment while simultaneously continuing the trend of declining prices. I am aware that on YouTube, stories about how the world is going to end tend to garner more attention than positive thinking. I should know that the study that predicted that society will collapse completely in 18 years was the subject of my most watched video ever. However, I believe it's critical to appreciate when things are going well. Similar to how the Australian Reserve Bank's governor did not anticipate inflation becoming so severe so rapidly. Personally, I didn't think it would resolve itself that rapidly. Following his lead, I believe it's crucial to correct that record so that everyone is aware of what's happening in the local economy. Thanks so much for watching the video. If you like this video, please hit the like button.